is the second story that we are going to discuss in this book. So, The Refusal is the title of a story written by Kafka, a very important author. It's very important to know that words matter, especially when it comes to the government and the law. And here, simply speaking, we are introduced to what's happening when some people in a small town are afraid to complain to the local official. And we need to know why they're too terrified to speak. We'll go here and start discussing the story. This story has a historical background that you need to know. But first, we are going to discuss the story itself. Now, in the beginning, we have the narrator introducing the setting of the story. If you remember, in any story, we are introduced to the exposition in the beginning. What's the exposition? We have the setting, the main characters in the beginning. Here, in the first line, we are introduced to the town where the story is taking place. It's very important to know that the story is lying so far from any other town. It's very desolate, it's very isolated. So by the plains and by the environment itself. Now here the description is mainly about how the town is very far from other towns and even from the capital. This is referring, or this is showing, the idea of isolation and how this idea would affect this town and the characters. Look at the last sentence. If one does not get lost on the way, one is bound to lose oneself in these towns, and to avoid them is impossible on count and side. So even if you want to travel from one place to another, it's very far. Even if you travel through the towns, you might be losing your way. Now here you can tell that the narrator of the story is actually a character in it. So here he says, I am. So we have the narrator, we have the main character telling us the story. What's the story here? Now, the story is introduced, as I told you, but by a description of how the town is very far from the capital and very far from other towns. Okay. And how the people in this town are governed by one person who was appointed at a position for so long. They don't even know if there is any logical or governmental paper to prove that this person is on top of the government inside the town. What do they call the highest official? He's the chief tax collector. He's the colonel in the town. So whenever they want to ask for anything, they need to ask the colonel. What happened is that when the narrator was so young, he's having a flashback, remembering that they had like an accident happening. The town was burned out and they needed to rebuild the town. So they needed not to pay taxes for a year in order to do what's needed in the town. Now we have here a description of how the man looked like and how the place he lived in looked like, and even his grandchildren. All the description here would clarify that this man is completely isolated from the townspeople. He does not speak the same language. He seems to be richer than them. So we can tell that there are barriers that there are barriers between the townspeople and this colonel and his family. Again, the idea of isolation and limits. Now here we have an explanation of the flashback or the incident. He's saying that once as a child I was present when a delegation of citizens arrived to ask him for a government subsidy because the poorest quarter of the town had been burned to the ground. So the main character remembers that he attended one of the events or the incidents that happened when the people in the town wanted to ask for the right to rebuild the town because of the fire. So what happened? His father, because he was a respected man, he was asked to speak with a delegation, with a group of people, in order to ask for a reduction of the taxes. Here, the main character is explaining the situation. He's telling us how the people gathered in front of the house of the colonel and how there were soldiers kept to watch. The idea of the soldiers here and the description of the soldiers, that they were talking in another dialect, would show that those soldiers do not belong to this town. If you remember, I told you that there is a historical background related to this story, which is colonization, or the idea of colonization. Some places were under the government of other places, or under the control, of other countries. Now here we can tell that the soldiers are foreigners. They do not belong to the townspeople, which is clear through their language. They are there to scare the people. If you read here from the description, you can tell that everybody was scared from them, although they did not show any aggression. This makes them the terror of the children. Not only the children, he spoke about also other people. You will have here a clear description of how the soldiers looked like. Their teeth, their eyes, and the way they stood and the way they scared the people. One more time. If the soldiers belonged to the town, would they cause this fear? Of course not. He even mentioned that even grown-ups were scared from those soldiers. And here, as I told you, the soldiers speak a different dialect. So what was happening? After being scared to speak in front of the colonel, finally they decided to speak up and ask the colonel here, they wanted to ask the colonel to allow them not to pay the government taxes for a whole year in order to rebuild the town. And we can call this a request or a petition. What's a petition? A petition here, you can find the word down, is like a complaint or a request that everybody would sign in order to ask for a specific request. What happens? He says that your petition is refused. He refused the petition. They have to pay the taxes for the government. Now down here we can see that the narrator is trying to show that from time to time, minor petitions are granted. He might agree on minor petitions, but not important petitions. So they, the townspeople or the villagers, kept trying and trying and trying to ask for some rights or some things that they needed. Most of the time they were refused, other times minor petitions were granted. We can tell that they didn't lose the hope, and that's why they kept trying and trying. But at the end, he said that it's the hope in the young generation who will keep trying to take what they want to take. Now, it's very important to look at the end when he said the citizens can always count on a refusal. So it's a normal thing to be refused, okay? And now the strange fact is that without his refusal, one simply cannot get along. Now, as if refusing something, or as if the repetition of refusing the petitions is something normal and safe for them. This is normal to be refused, okay? So here we have an open end for the story in which he hopes that the younger generation would one day have like a revolution, or would be able to find a way in order to achieve what they have ever wanted. Which here you have the words, quite young fellows, in fact, who are incapable of foreseeing the consequences of the least significant, far less revolutionary idea. It is among just them that discontent creeps in.